evening. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
And my name is Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and a licensed mental health counselor. And I want to thank everybody who's been giving us comments and encouragement. But I would still like to encourage people to please contact us. Our hope that this program was going to be a dialogue, if you will, comments, questions, things about that are affecting you. So again, I'm going to take a moment to repeat this. Send questions and comments to Let's Talk About Mental Health at gmail.com or text us at 802-490-3590.
Well, and we also have a site on Facebook. You can friend us there. And as you see on the screen, it is case sensitive, so capitalize the L and the T and the VT. And after Tuesday afternoons, you can, by friending us, watch this show anytime, streaming it from the internet.
Okay. Well, last week we did a show on women, and I think it's almost natural that, well, I don't know if it's natural, but to follow through this evening and talk a little bit about relationships and about how alcohol and drug addiction, alcoholism, and mental illness, how they affect relationships. And in the beginning, I was sort of worried about it, like how we all have relationships. We have numerous relationships in our lives, and so, I didn't want to so much talk about. I want to talk about intimate relationships, and not sexual, but the ones that matter to us, the ones in our lives. So, it's kind of sad that with alcoholism and drug addiction, the ones we tend to hurt the most are our family members or the people that care about us.
Yeah. I mean, spouses, our children, our parents, very close circles of friends as well.
Right, and one of the things that for years I did something called Family Education Day, and it was so sad sometimes to have families come in and they would almost be overwhelmed by their illness, and there's this dilemma about loving somebody and caring about somebody, and just seeing them sort of fall apart, or you get that sense that you're losing them. And I can remember sometimes during my presentations, I would notice a family member begin to cry, and I would know that in some ways that they were already grieving the loss of their loved one. They had already begun that grief process, feeling like, I've lost this person to this disease, I've lost this person to this illness. And it's you see it sometimes with children, you'll see it sometimes, and I think in some ways, and I don't know, I don't mean to offend anybody, but in some ways, the alcoholic or the addict, they have their own life struggles. But they don't really always appreciate what's happening to the people around them and about the things that are happening to the ones that they love. And I think that, one of the things that when we talk about intimacy and when we talk about relationships, a big one for me anyway is one of trust. And I think with a drug addiction and alcoholism, you learn that you really can't trust them. I mean, I used to work with a doctor who used to say, I believe in you, but I don't trust your disease. And I think there's some truth to that it's just, you find yourself not believing in them, you can't trust what they say, you can't trust that they're going to be where they say they're going to be. And I think trust is probably at least one of the foundation stones of successful, healthy relationships.
Yeah. And I think, like you were saying, the rupture in the relationships that happens, whether it's with depression or with alcohol or drug use, there is a sort of a withdrawal, whether it is in the pursuit of your drug that then becomes more important than the relationships with loved ones, or even if it's depression, which then by its very nature has you withdrawing and becoming isolated as well as you become more and more depressed.
Right, and you'll see it again with last night I was watching a program with Brian Lamb, and he was interviewing a man who wrote a book about warriors of PTSD, guys, and he wrote his first book about guys who were fighting in Iraq, and then he wrote his second book about them coming home, and he said, the first book was about them fighting war over there, and now the second book is really about the war that's occurring here. And again, it was really tragic. You would see the trauma of something that happened before show up again and destroy the life some more. Right. The aftermath of PTSD, I think, is really, it's horrible what happens to the person who has nightmares and really lives in the terrors. But it's really difficult for family members because they just don't know how to deal with it.
Well, if you think about it, when relationships, they either end, they fall apart, or they sort of live through various transitions. But I think a very important piece, as you're saying this, you know, fighting the war at home, is that they come home, they're not the person that their partner fell in love with. They're not the father or the mother that the children used to have. They're not the same son or daughter of their parents as well. And this is a very big change. It doesn't adhere to the expectations they had initially, to the actual experience they had in the early part of the relationship. And that's a make or break point, right? How do you then continue?
Yeah, and you see it sometimes with alcohol families where the families begin to settle for less and less. And I've noticed this over the years, that sometimes there's this, there's almost like a tolerance that they get for the other person's behavior or the other person's activities. And they have compassion, they have empathy for them. But at some point their tolerance just burns out. Like there's a point where they just say, I can't do this anymore. I'm done with this. We're over.
Right. Yeah.
And it's really, and sometimes the thing that happens is minor compared to some of the other things that have happened, but it's almost literally like, I can't do this anymore. Right. And what they're really saying, I think, on some level, since they already know what happened has already happened, can't undo it, is I can't live in anticipation of this going on. I can't face this continuation of living this way. Right. And I think that's really, in some ways, one of the great tragedies of alcoholism and mental illness, is when we end up losing our families. Right. And we end up losing the people that care and love about us.
Yeah, and I think that when you get to this point, I mean, early on in a relationship, meeting somebody new or in a relationship that's worked over time, the benefit is clear. You know, you love the activities that you share, the sense of regard for each other, that their advantage and the give and the take feels equal and it feels rewarding, that I get back as much as I give. And then I think when things like mental illness intrude, whether it's PTSD or whether it's depression or whether it's somebody's addiction, it gets to a point then when you start to question, what's the benefit of staying in this relationship? What's the price for staying in this relationship? And maybe at some point then you start to compare what is the benefits of leaving this relationship and what will be the benefit of the risk of leaving this relationship. And that when you get into that point where you sort of teeter-totter between those various facets of it, that's when you have these days where you're almost forced to say, wow, what am I doing here?
Right. And I think, because of my life experience and our life's experiences, it's often I've worked with people who have both an illness of addiction and another psychiatric illness together. And sometimes it's sort of, they go hand in hand. There's someone depressed and they drink a lot, or someone has PTSD and they're using drugs, or they're dealing with those issues. But it's often, it just seems like it gets to, one of the things that I see sometimes is that a lot of times by the time I got to working with people, they've really lost everything. Once in a while, when I used to do Family Day, a lot of times I would get family members, if there was young children, say 20, 18, 19, 20-year-old, or very older adults, I would get their children in. But a lot of times the ones in the middle, a lot of the family wouldn't come. They were sort of overwhelmed by life. They were sort of had enough, or they'd been to previous treatments. We've talked about relapse before in this program and how that can be so wearing on people. The first time they say, I'm not going to do this anymore, you believe them. Second, third, at some point you go,
Right. So there's
they lose faith.
There's reciprocal actions going on there. So when the person with the mental illness, whether it's depression or anxiety or addiction that causes them to pull away from the relationship, then you're seeing sort of an equal, like the whole physics, equal actions and reactions. The family members are doing the same thing, right? I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to withdraw as the ill person starts to become more and more self-centered and more isolated.
Right, and again, I've also seen where family members really almost become passionate about getting the medications for their loved one, because they're really hoping, give them, it must be a medication. It must be something you can give them. Just, something, don't take that med from them. Quite literally. And then sometimes it's benzodiazepine, sometimes it's other things, but they can't figure out if the medicine is helping or not helping, or it's sort of like it's what I see, you know, what happens at the end, you know, and that's why they talk about alcoholism, and I think probably mental illness too, is a family disease. It isn't as if one person has that disease. I mean, I think the illnesses affect everybody in the family.
Yeah.
And it has a deadly effect on, you know, on a really personal, intimate level sometimes, where it not only destroys hope. It is, you know what I mean? Like, you know, sometimes if you love somebody who's sick, you know, you can believe that they're going to get better. But sometimes what you'll see is you'll see people sort of give up. And that's what I meant before about the grief of some folks, is that they give up on someone getting better. And they begin to resign themselves that, you know, what I had was lost. And what I'm hoping for, I'll never get.
Yeah.
And I think that's really difficult.
And again, it's a break with what's natural. One of the sort of a model for this that's always appealed to me is by a fellow named Eric Erickson, who talks about sort of psychosocial development. And he, you know, outlines 8 stages that we go through, from the point of the newborn infant who is feeding, all the way through then to, you know, the elderly person, and that we develop throughout our life. So it's not just develop, it's not something little kids do as they learn to talk and toilet train and jump and that sort of thing. And what reminds me of this is when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned the word trust and mistrust in a relationship. That's actually the very first stage that we go through in our social development, is trust versus mistrust. And basically this relies on whether or not the infant can trust the caregivers to give it what it needs, to meet its needs. And then if that develops, then that sets the foundation then for the next stage, which has to do with sort of breaking away their own development and developing their autonomy. And eventually get to the point where you develop as an individual, and that's a very important process. That's our job in development when we're in our, you know, say from 12 to 19, you know, the sort of tween to teen years. And then, so as we hit, you know, around late teens, early 20s, then the stage of intimacy. So, you know, developing sort of our sense of ourselves as an individual and what our roles are. And then the next stage there is then we're able then to develop intimate relationships, or else we become isolated. So that stage is called intimacy versus isolation. And so you can imagine then with a lot of our folks who are using drugs that are starting in their teens, that they don't develop a good sense of themselves. And then without doing that, you're not able to bring into a relationship a cohesive sense of yourself that then allows you to form an equal partnership where there's that give and take that we expect with a close and intimate relationship.
Right. And you know, my friend Mark was saying the other day that, you know, one of the things that affects relationships is substance abuse. Another one is infidelity, and you naming a few that are blocks to intimacy. And then you mentioned earlier, before that, in some ways in alcoholism, it almost becomes like you're unfaithful to your partner.
Right.
I mean, the same thing with drugs. It's like that point where alcohol or drugs becomes a character in your life story. In other words, you almost refer to it. You know, like you'll find alcoholics who talk to their booze, make bargains with their dues. You know, like we'll only drink a little bit now, we'll drink more later. You know, and also sometimes in the families, the illness becomes like a capital L-I. You know what I mean? Like there's so you know Joe's problem. Or you know that.
Well, it becomes the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah,
it's there,
sort of. Yeah,
and
everybody's aware of it. But the elephant in the room is often that no one mentions it. I think when alcoholism and sometimes like with PTSD and depression, I think they do talk about it, but they talk about it as an independent force, if you will. Yeah. And I think sometimes in families, is you know, one of the most tragic statements you run into. You know, if you love me, you wouldn't do this.
Right.
And people get confused about that. I mean, you know, people are sick, and it doesn't have, I mean, it's not all about love. Now,
I mean, you wouldn't say if you love me, you wouldn't be depressed.
Yeah, but you know, you wonder about that, you know, because people do make great sacrifices, and they do make sacrifice for their loved ones. But, I mean, alcoholics and addicts and people who struggle with, like, depression or anxiety disorder or PTSD or even like personality disorder, it's sort of hard to sort of figure out how to change that. You are what you are, you do what you do. A lot of people think this is how I survive in life, this is how I make it in life. So I just want to say, I mean, when we talk about you know, alcoholism or drug addiction, when we talk about its effect on the family and loved ones and primary relationships, it's really it becomes a force, if you will. It becomes, and you can't regulate it, you can't trust it. And one of the things that I think are destructive to relationships is fear. And I think one of the things that comes out of the is that people become afraid. They become afraid of the outcome. They become afraid of the future.
Well, it's part of, I can't trust you anymore.
Yeah.
Because I've heard, when it gets described as an affair in a way, as an infidelity, the presence of the addiction, because you are, in a way, sort of forsaking your family, if you will, by using the drug, pulling away from your obligations, pulling away from your responsibilities. It becomes such a focus of your time that you give up other duties. And this very much leads to your absence, which is a lot in common with an affair. And then, of course, do we know anything that introduces such a level of mistrust in a relationship than an infidelity, than an affair?
And, you know, if you don't, we talk a little bit about recovery. I mean, because, you know, people do get better, and there are changes. People get into treatment, people get help, they get the right medications. But that really is not the end of the problem. I mean, that is really like, oh, all right, now I'm on the right meds, or, you know, now that I'm not drinking anymore, I guess everything will be okay. And that's really not true.
No, because damage has been done, right? I mean, how many times have we worked with people who, in their heart, maybe they think, this is really the time I mean it. I recognize the pain that I've caused for people that I love, and I really want to get better. And then the pain that they, in turn, experience and struggle with because they're not trusted.
Right.
People have been hurt so many times that they have now withdrawn. Just like, you know, sort of the finger from the stove. You do that once and you don't want to get burned again. They're waiting. And they're waiting and watching to see if this is actually the time. And that's a very, very painful experience for the person who's struggling with a mental illness.
Right. And I've seen this with addiction, that they'll finally lose and they'll come into recovery, and they'll get into recovery when it's I know I've said this on the show before, but it's so sad that people used to remark that sometimes people don't get better until they lose everything. I mean, it's like, it's just so sad. But one of the problems is one of the first things they do in recovery sometimes is they look for a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, right, because I mean that's one of the things that got us to think about this topic was classically, I mean, AA probably originated this, but the idea is that your first year in recovery, don't start a new relationship, and then to take it even a little bit farther, when you think you're ready, get a plant. Right? And if you don't kill the plant, then get a pet. Yeah. And then if the pet does okay, now you can think about a relationship. Yeah. And how many, I mean, who lives by that?
Yeah. You know, and the thing is, and that's where it gets a little confusing, because, you know, newcomer will hear that and they'll react to it as if, oh, they don't want me to be sexually active or whatever, you know. And it's really not that. I mean, it's really this idea like, you know, how do you live with somebody? Right. And I think sometimes there's an assumption that just getting sober or just getting on the right meds is going to help you figure out like how to live with somebody. Yes. And I have to say, some of the folks I've worked with, they started using fairly early in their lives, or their mental illness is so severe that they've had difficulty in previous relationships. And so it isn't like an automatic that the first relationship that you get in is going to work.
Right.
And the concern you have most of the time with people in recovery is that, you know, we all know it's true that we show up with baggage and, you know, with our next
all of us do, healthy or
not. All
not,
of us do,
right?
yeah. But, you know, sometimes it's sort of like a lot of it shows up. And then, you know, people don't know how to deal with it. And obviously one of the ways that addicts and alcoholics always have to be careful about is one way to make yourself feel better is to take a drink or a drug. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, and so that's the big danger, I think, with relationships. It isn't so much like, oh, my God, you know, we don't want you to have one. It's just that there's a higher risk, perhaps, of relapse. When we know there's going to be, you know, not everything goes perfect. Mm-hmm. Not everything goes according to plan. And I want to be careful about this, but I think some people, they grew up in alcoholic homes, or they grew up with mental illness. They maybe didn't get a lot of tenderness. Maybe they didn't get a lot of affection. Maybe there's some issues around attachment disorder. I don't know. You know, I mean, I really don't know. And they start using at an early age, and it's just really difficult to make it work. I mean, and I know that, you know, you would love to think that, you know, being in love and having a relationship is not something you have to work at. But I don't know.
You're in trouble if you think it's not something you have to work at, right?
Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
So
Well, again, I think too, like the idea of developing yourself as an individual before you are, capable then to have a healthy, intimate relationship. I think that idea of those developmental stages is very much the same or parallel to the advice in early recovery. You really need to become a new person and work out who that is before you start a new relationship and then start to invest the energy in that as opposed to your recovery.
Right. It's so difficult, and I used to make a point of recommending Al-Anon to family members or Narconon for people struggling with narcotics, and the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, NAMI.
Right.
They all had meetings, and you can say that to family members, but again, a lot of times you'll run into it. They'll recognize and they'll focus on the patient. They'll focus on the one who's with the illness.
Yeah. And we've used this term codependency, which I've told you I really don't like it because it just sounds like psychobabble. But again, I've often looked at relationships and described this to patients as it's really very simple mathematics. If I don't get back as much as I give, then I'm going to stop that relationship. And we sort of see that throughout our lives. We shed friends, we take on new friends, and they become deeper, more more important relationships to us. And I think that one of the things that organizations like Al-Anon, Narconon, and NAMI give to, say, the loved ones of the person who is suffering with a mental illness is, how do you take care of yourself? What is the right way to sort of approach the relationship as your partner is struggling with the grips of their relationship?
Right.
What's the right thing for you to do?
And I think, again, it's like, how do you draw the line between compassion and empathy and helping? And this is so difficult for family members. I mean, I can remember distinctly a family member would get this idea of codependency and enabling, and they would just be sort of almost heartbroken. Like somebody would say to them, well, one of the reasons they're so sick is that you enable them.
Right.
And then their loved one says, can you help me? And they go, no, I can't help you. I'm not going to rescue you anymore,
Right.
And so you have this sort of, I don't know, sometimes the alcoholic or the addict will feel abandoned, like, oh my God, they don't love me anymore, they don't care anymore. Or you'll have the loved one feeling guilty about what care they gave them, I've kept them sick. And I guess it's just so, it's so confusing sometimes. And I don't think any clinician should stand and judge of what family members do or don't do for their loved ones, it's too easy to do that. Because you just don't know.
And we don't know what's going to cause people to change either.
Right.
I've met some, this seemed to happen quite often where I would, you're trying to find out what's the hook to get some change going. And you'd find sort of the late teen, early 20-year-old person is living at home, getting money for their drugs, no threat of being kicked out. And they're saying they want to change. I'm like, what do you mean you want to change? The situation's perfect. You don't want to make any changes. And then you start to dig into what is it that is not working and what is it that you really want. And I think that a lot of times the couple, when you talk about enabling or what have you, they're trying to figure it out. They don't know. They're trying to find what is it going to be that's going to change, trying to hold on to that relationship. And I think you're right. Sometimes you just have to sort of step back and be a sounding board, because we can do as much harm as good.
And I think one of the interesting things when people go to NAMI meetings or Al-Anon meetings, you can go in there and you think people are going to tell you what to do or how to do this. But once again, I think in most of these meetings, what you find out is that you go in there and you talk about yourself, and then the next person talks and they talk about themselves. And there's, and if you listen up, you might hear some wisdom or you might hear some suggestions, but there's very little of like, well, here's what you're supposed to do, because nobody really knows what you're supposed to do. I mean, as far as like, here's exactly what you need to do. I mean, and I remember we had the women on from the Women's Crisis Center, Freedom House.
Freedom Center, yeah.
And I asked them, what did they say? And they said, well, we always ask them, what do they want to do? And I think that's really, one of the things that you have to sort of figure out when you reach out for help and you're in this, difficult relationship. You want to be careful about, what is it that you want? What would make your life better? And I think one of the things that will happen is that, like you said earlier, you want to regain a sense of self. I mean, I think one of the worst things that happens to people who are codependent or people who are, is that their life is controlled by somebody else's illness, and that person's illness is out of control. And I think that's what really makes it so difficult. And I think one of the things that the healthy person needs to do is to stay healthy and figure out a way to do that. Now, that's a lot easier said than done, but that, I think, is the challenge.
And it's often pain that drives people into treatment, right? For families to consider, is this working? Do we not stay in this relationship? Or patients will come in just sort of wanting some kind of pain to end, consequences. And that's just a starting point, because really while we're wired to avoid pain, the things that keep us going and keep us in healthy relationships are pleasure, right? I mean, the chemistry that we have in our brains is about seeking pleasure. That's tied in very much to the way we connect and fall in love and then maintain love. And it's the relationships that this is all about, right? We've talked about that a few times. And I think when we read there was a study, the grant study, that followed Harvard students for many decades. And what it came down to was, as you had said once, they were paraphrasing from the Beatles song, love is the answer. The thing that matters in our life, being the pack animals that we are and having the evolution, the biology that we have, it's our relationships. And we're nothing without those. We're not meant to live in isolation. And our development from birth to the day that we die and having successful development really is based on relationships.
I worked with adult children of alcoholic parents, and there was that movement. And so I work with a lot of adults who grew up in alcoholic homes. And I think that when you think about how children are affected sometimes, and it's very complicated. I mean, I remember reading about the study of Holocaust survivors' children, what it was like for them to be in that family. They were not able to talk about sadness or grief because their sadness didn't match up. I mean, it's very complicated. I'm not trying to make light of anything like, but I think that almost needs a special, maybe another program at some point, to just talk about the effects of children, and what does it mean when children grow up from those type of families. I'm just saying that because I didn't want to neglect that, and I don't want to make believe it doesn't happen. I just want to say that I think it's really hard to know. Sometimes children are really different. One brother is different than the other brother, and we know that the stages of the illness are sometimes different. But yet we also know that children learn by what they see, and with alcoholism and drug addiction, we're also always sometimes concerned about genetic things.
Right. Yeah.
So,
but like we're talking about, how do you learn to nurture? How do you learn what relationships are supposed to be like? We basically picked that up from, to use a term often used, from our tribe, from our family, from the people around us. We learn by imitation. I mean, how many of us have, who become parents, have said something and all of a sudden, oh my God, I just became my father, I just became my mother by the thing I said. That is such a natural thing to imitate. And when you look at anxiety and separation, attachment in general, a lot of that is based on the children are going to act in a way that mirrors the way that the parents act with them. So again, if you can't count on being nurtured, if you can't count on a consistent environment because, for example, alcoholism in one or both parents, this is going to affect you as you grow up. And we have seen, right, there are a lot of sort of characteristics. You can almost recognize the adult child of an alcoholic based on their sense of themselves and the way that they respond to certain situations.
So I think that what we need to do is probably follow up on this, and I know that we just scratched the surface on this tonight, and so perhaps again I want to mention that about comments. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, I would really like to encourage you to share them with us. Use our Facebook, use the telephone number that we had before.
Texting, email, Facebook.
Thank you all very much.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Ready? 1, 2, 3.